Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. My name is Stephanie Honey. I am a trade policy consultant and former New Zealand trade negotiator, and it is my great pleasure to introduce this afternoon the Right Honourable Greg Hands MP. The Minister has had a distinguished career in central and local government for over 2 decades, including as Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Minister for London, Minister of State for Trade and Investment, and currently as Minister of State for Trade Policy. I think we would all agree that uncertainty has been the mood music for 2020. The disruptions of the pandemic, challenges to the global rules-based trading system, digital transformation, looming climate change impacts, a recognition that we need to find a way to make trade work better for all in our societies. These have all been part of the trade landscape this year. And for the United Kingdom, of course, this year is the lead-in to its independent role as Global Britain on the international trade stage. So we are very privileged to have the Minister here to deliver the keynote remarks on the new trade environment at our conference this afternoon. With that, Minister, I pass you the floor.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining, for allowing me to join you and for having me as your guest. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this important conference. The theme of this event, Advancing Inclusivity and Sustainability Through Trade in the 21st Century, resonates very strongly with me and what the UK government is trying to achieve. So I'm delighted to be able to address you today, albeit virtually. Although New Zealand has had a remarkably successful COVID response, sadly, this has not been true of the global picture overall. World trade has fallen sharply in the wake of the pandemic, as social distancing measures and then growing unemployment has hit demand for both services and goods imports. WTO, World Trade Organization data shows that global trade in goods contracted by 14.3% in the second quarter of 2020, the sharpest ever one-period decline recorded, exceeding even that brought on by the global financial crisis now more than 10 years ago. Of course, the future outlook for trade depends heavily on how governments and businesses and consumers respond, how quickly and if short-term protectionist measures are repealed, and how we adapt to the new normal. In the first 3 months of the crisis, countries adopted both restrictive and liberalizing trade measures, mainly on medical and critical to life goods. The evidence suggests that many will be temporary, although the impact of a second wave or even a third wave remains to be seen. The potential vulnerability of global supply chains has accelerated pre-existing trends towards onshoring or nearshoring and regionalization as countries actively seek to improve resilience. The pandemic has also had widely different sectoral impacts, accelerating things like e-commerce and digital trade, and digital interaction like the one we're doing today, but potentially slowing others, such as the transition to greener technologies. For its part, the UK is adapting to a post-COVID world by championing an open and rules-based trading system and increasing market access for UK businesses. Joining with New Zealand and other like-minded partners, our approach is to encourage tariff liberalisation, oppose export restrictions where appropriate, and ensure that any crisis response measures that are necessary are proportionate, temporary, transparent, and do not unnecessarily disrupt or unwind global value chains. The alternative to sustain the protectionism which we have seen across the globe threatens to fragment the global trading system, lower productivity, and raising prices. A fragmented world, returning to great power politics, will make multilateral solutions to global trading issues more difficult to achieve. And I think the UK and New Zealand will work together and be one on that. And that is why the UK supports multilateral cooperation, urging countries to take cooperative and practical steps to ensure that the impact on international trade and its knock-on effects for global growth and productivity are as limited as possible. And we know that in this, we have a key ally in New Zealand. This was demonstrated in the Declaration on Trade in Essential Goods that New Zealand signed with Singapore earlier this year, as well as other plurilateral initiatives, such as the Joint Ministerial Statement on Supply Chain Connectivity. We want to continue working with New Zealand and like-minded partners to build on these initiatives. In particular, that means working to improve and modernize the global trading system to help provide governments and businesses with the certainty around the rules necessary for trade to flourish. The UK has always been a strong supporter of the rules-based international system and has placed an active role in support of the WTO, the primary method of governance for international commerce, playing a vital role in securing free, fair, and rules-based international trade. Our UK priorities include ensuring that the WTO has a fully functioning dispute settlement mechanism and modernising the rule book to account for new trends such as digitalisation and the growth of services. Well, neither of those is a very new trend, but they're growing trends. Most of the rules that govern global trade were, of course, written 25 years ago. The paralysis of the WTO appellate body means it is currently difficult to resolve disputes on environmental grounds, for example. So we want WTO members to collectively address these challenges to strengthen and reform the system so that it can deliver for all countries and for everyone, businesses and consumers. We welcome the progress on the MSMEs joint initiative as a good first step to re-establishing the relevance of the organisation. Vital next steps are fisheries subsidies and women's economic empowerment. The world is changing, and WTO members need to find new points of balance in the rules that govern trade in these vital areas. This includes empowering developing countries to play a role in shaping the global trade system. Given this backdrop and the challenge of reaching agreements with all WTO member states, given the diversity of interests, we need to pursue a twin-track approach supported by bilateral free trade agreements, or FTAs, and plurilateral agreements with coalitions of the willing. And that is why the UK is pursuing an ambitious programme of free trade agreements. Our aim, stated on our election manifesto this time a year ago, is to cover 80% of UK trade with FTAs within the next 3 years, starting with the United States, Australia, and of course New Zealand, potentially paving the way to our joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP-11 or the CPTPP, depending on your particular preference for nomenclature. And of course, we are delighted that New Zealand is supportive of our joining, and we know that New Zealand plays a really key role in CPTPP. This can all help encourage business, build resilience, and support the post-COVID economic recovery. It is also part of our strong commitment to the Asia-Pacific region and the opportunities it offers to UK businesses, from Southeast and East Asia to Australasia, and indeed the Americas as well. Our priorities on the global stage, set by the UK Trade Secretary Liz Truss in her speech to the WTO in March, are fourfold. First, we want to boost economic resilience by promoting resilient supply chains, as I've already mentioned. Second, we want to level up the global playing field by liberalising trade in services, such as through the WTO joint initiative on the domestic regulation of services. We believe this is a vast untapped source of opportunity for economic growth, which could lead to faster innovation, lower prices, and help diffuse trade tensions. And obviously that's something that's strongly, I think, in the UK and the New Zealand interest. In the UK, 80% of our employment, 79% of our GDP is produced by the services sector. Third, we want to retool the global trading system to accommodate technological change, particularly the impact of digital trade. And that is why the UK is an active participant in the WTO joint initiative on e-commerce, and why we are pursuing ambitious digital provisions in our FTA program, not least through the recently signed UK-Japan deal. We are also discussing ambitious digital provisions in our trade negotiations with New Zealand. With a shared desire to be ambitious and New Zealand's track record of innovation in digital trade, including in recent agreements such as the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement, a trade agreement provides the perfect opportunity to reduce barriers to e-commerce and stimulate investment in new technologies particularly low carbon technologies. Ensuring ambitious outcomes on digital trade also supports our objectives for SME-friendly trade practices and women's economic empowerment through digital trade, a shared priority for New Zealand under your Trade for All initiative. And finally, we want to use trade as a vehicle for driving clean growth, an objective the UK will be pursuing through our presidencies of both COP26 with the conference in Glasgow next autumn and the G7 next year as well, and one that we know that New Zealand shares very closely. We hope that our proposed FTA, UK-New Zealand, that will support both our countries' net zero climate commitments, reaffirm our respective commitments to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and, of course, the Paris Agreement, and set an example of high standards for clean growth. And last week, the UK joined its first World Trade Organization grouping in its own right. Of course, we've been a founding member of the World Trade Organization, as indeed of GATT, but have not, due to our EU membership, have not been an independent part of the World Trade Organization, at least not since February when we left the European Union. So last week, we joined the first WTO grouping in our own right, and we're eager to work with fellow members of the Friends of Advancing Sustainable Trade, or FAST, to ensure that trade and environmental policies work in tandem. We have already seen good progress on this in the first rounds of the negotiations to build on a comprehensive environment chapter with clean growth outcomes across the FTA, such as green procurement and sustainable finance. To conclude, these are unprecedented times, but amongst the uncertainty, there are opportunities that New Zealand and the UK, as two like-minded countries, can look to build on. We have a shared vision for international trade, a shared desire to sign an ambitious, future-proof bilateral FTA, and a shared willingness to work in international fora on mutual goals. In particular, maintaining open, rules-based trade, resilient supply chains, liberalizing trade and services, accommodating digital trade, and promoting clean growth. Together, we can champion and modernize the free trading system, work towards a low-carbon economic recovery, and build a better and more resilient trade infrastructure for all. Thank you very much indeed for your attention.
Well, thank you very much for those insights, Minister. There's a lot there, and perhaps we could dig a little bit deeper on some of those very important topics that you've talked about. I guess perhaps as a starting point, we could talk about the big coronavirus-shaped elephant in the room, COVID-19. Obviously, as you've illustrated so vividly in your remarks, there's been a huge impact on economies as well as global trade. You've talked about those four elements of UK trade policy as part of the way to achieve rebuilding and revitalisation of economies. What more broadly do you think are the trade policy settings that we will need to get the global economy back on track in this very disrupted environment?
Well, thank you. It's a very good question. And clearly different countries have had different economic experiences as a result of COVID. The UK, we've recorded our biggest economic downturn for 300 years. Thankfully, we're already starting to recover, at least before the most recent lockdown started. But look, our growth projections are quite good for the next 2 years, but we won't get back to the UK, the size of the UK economy until I think late 2022, which will show you the degree of impact that COVID has had in the UK. Look, 3 or 4 things. I think the first thing is we have to work together to make sure plurilaterally, multilaterally, that trade restrictions put in place during the pandemic are lifted as soon as possible, particularly those trade restrictions that are put in place on medical devices, pharmaceuticals, other health-related goods. I think, secondly, we need to look at some of us are facing an over-dependence on particular trade partners for particular goods in particular. The PPE crisis in Europe, at least, has shown most European countries, and I dare say the experience is not dissimilar in New Zealand dependence on China in particular for supplying PPE. So I think the ability to diversify our sources of supply, onshoring or nearshoring, I don't think is really going to be overall the solution for free and open trading, diverse trading countries like the UK and New Zealand. But there may be a role for a little bit of that. But to be frank, I think diversifying our sources of supply. I think in terms of the international trading system, look, trade was already in trouble going into the crisis. In terms of trade had stopped growing faster than international global GDP a couple of years back. So we need to do everything. We can't blame it all on the crisis. We need real addressing, bringing the WTO forward, making sure the WTO functions again properly, bring the US properly back into the World Trade Organization, I think is really important. So all of these things, look, I think there's an awful lot to do. Some of it has been exacerbated by COVID, but a lot of these issues were there before the crisis came along, and we need to work together. Particularly, it's a great opportunity for like-minded countries like the UK and New Zealand to work together, countries that are really dependent on a good, free-flowing international trade, to work together and use our influence with like-minded partners to make those changes.
Excellent. I think you would get no argument from New Zealand on any of those points. It's absolutely crucial that we sustain global conversations and global collaboration on all of these topics. Another area where, of course, New Zealand and the UK have a very strong commonality of interest and a determination to make a difference, as you talked about, is this question around clean growth, building back better in terms of accelerating our transition to a low carbon economy. Obviously, I think everyone is grappling with exactly how to bring climate change into the global trade conversation. How do you see us making progress in this area?
Well, I think we are very like-minded on this, and we're really looking forward. I think there's different ways of doing it. Writing it into trade agreements, that is something the UK will be looking to do with willing partners. But also, I think we can send a message, particularly the UK-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, and particularly with reference to our COP26 chairmanship coming up this coming year. Actually, we can lead by example, as well as writing it into the trade rules between us. The UK and New Zealand could put that in our FTA and show the world, look, actually, we can make trade can be sustainable. Trade should be sustainable. Trade will be sustainable. And we need to make sure that trade is not juxtaposed with our climate change obligations, but absolutely enhances our climate change obligations. Make sure that something that we've done in the UK as we've left the European Union, we've taken, for example, the EU's common external tariff, and we've turned it into what we call the UK Global Tariff. And we haven't increased any tariff lines at all from the EU's overall scheme of tariffs. We've definitely simplified them, reduced them, and we've eliminated them entirely in areas like environmental goods. 104 different environmental goods. We've eliminated tariff lines entirely. I mean, sometimes odd stuff. Is hard to know why the European Union had a tariff on things like steam turbines, which are fantastically environmentally friendly things to have. So we've done that. So again, a lot of it is leading by example. And that's where I think the UK and New Zealand together in our free trade agreement can really show some cutting edge elements on trade, the environment and climate change.
Fantastic. And of course, I think we'd see fossil fuel subsidy elimination as a very central part of that too. Turning to, I guess, one of the other major themes of this conference, so sustainability, but also inclusion. It was very heartening to hear the great advocacy you talked about in your remarks on enhancing the participation of MSMEs or small businesses in trade, women's economic empowerment. How do you see us actually making concrete progress in that area? I think one of the challenges we face is we've recognised the problem, but how do we really get to finding the solutions? So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot, again, that we can do bilaterally in that space. And I think a lot that we can do at the WTO. I think I think the key thing at the WTO will be to go with what is possible as well as trying to reform and change the organization. I think women's economic empowerment, a good deal on that. The UK launched our own She Trades initiative last year. We've got the Commonwealth trade ministers coming up this coming year as well. CHOGM coming up as well. I think the Commonwealth is very like-minded on that, and certainly the UK and New Zealand are. So I think women's economic empowerment through trade is going to be an extremely important part of that. Liz Truss, my own Secretary of State, puts a lot of store by that. I think in terms of SMEs and MSMEs, again, a lot can be done in trade agreements. If you take the example of the trade agreement we're working on with the US at the moment, actually, both countries started that process by publishing our objectives for the agreement. And if you compared the two objectives, put them side by side, the two documents from the UK and the US, the thing that really stands out that both sides really want to do is a really good chapter on SMEs. And people may say, well, hold on, Mr. Hands, you're going to produce a chapter. Do you not realize, I'm running an SME, I've got 6 people here, we're producing this, that, or the other, or this, that, or the other service, we're an architect's firm or something. I don't have time to read a whole trade agreement. And the idea behind an SME chapter is typically to put all of the most helpful parts of the trade agreement in one chapter and make that user-friendly. So SMEs can see what is in the trade agreement to allow them to start exporting or to enhance their exports to a market like the US or a market like New Zealand. So that's what we're looking to do for SMEs. In the UK, I don't know what the situation is like in New Zealand, but in the UK, about 90% of SMEs don't export at all. So getting more SMEs to cross the boundary in the first place. The third area I'd pull out in terms of inclusive trade is what we can do for developing countries. And here again, I think the UK and New Zealand are like-minded. How do we make trade work better for developing countries? How do we use trade to lift people out of poverty? And I was struck speaking to, I was doing a conference just last week with the East Africa Association and talking about just in my lifetime, or my adult lifetime. I left university in 1989, just literally as the Berlin Wall was falling, the Cold War ended. How much trade has done to reduce global poverty, taking 1.2 billion people out of extreme poverty since 1990. Unfortunately, COVID is likely to put around 150 million people back into extreme poverty. So it will undo about 10% of that improvement in the last 30 years. But we've got a long way further to go. And I think using trade as a way of empowering developing countries, so long as the rules are fair, and so long as we show those really generous trade preferences the UK is looking to do as well, then I think that's also a way of making trade more inclusive globally.
Thank you. Yes, I could not agree more on developing countries. And of course, I think one of the approaches that New Zealand has always really championed in that space is agricultural trade reform, obviously a very core part of the economies of many of those countries. And for us, of course, Indigenous communities, enabling Māori economic development is crucial too. So I hope we can do some good things in our FTA there. Of course, one of the other things that's widely acknowledged as enabling inclusion is digital technology, and you mentioned this in your remarks too. You said that you would be keen to see a very sort of ambitious, gold standard digital chapter in our FTA. I think, from our point of view, we would love to see the UK joining our deeper agreement, Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, that we signed earlier this year virtually with Singapore and Chile. So will we see the UK signing on to DEPA anytime soon, or how can we really, future-proof our trade relationship in that space?
Well, look, we're really excited. We watch very closely what New Zealand does. New Zealand is a really exciting country, what it does in trade agreements. And for it far punches above its weight in the world of world trade. And often smaller countries can and do. Sometimes that's part of their history. Sometimes they're necessities. So you take a country like Singapore, sort of necessity drove it really to become a global trading powerhouse. So we really do look closely at what others are doing. And the area of digital trade, we've looked very, very keenly at what New Zealand, what Australia is also doing, Singapore, and you mentioned Chile as well, and that's all very exciting. I mean, what we're looking to do is also, I think, looking to be very progressive on digital trade. The first trade deal that we've done is actually the UK-Japan deal, which largely takes the EU-Japan deal that the UK is already party to and turns it into a UK-only deal. But we go further in 3 or 4 key areas. And one of those areas is on data and digital. Partly, I mean, to be honest, it's enlightened self-interest. The UK, we've got a fantastic fintech sector, huge companies which will be known in New Zealand like TransferWise. The UK is, after the US, the #2 player in the world on fintech. And fintech doesn't like things like data localization rules. It's quite an expensive way of setting up an operation abroad, particularly, I would say, for smaller or relatively smaller markets like New Zealand. If you have a data localization rule, you're kind of then starting to think, gosh, the terms of trade here, is it going to be worthwhile to have to do this? So I think what we're looking to do, what we've done with Japan, has been to remove things like unnecessary data localization rules. So long as we're consistent with the protection of people's personal data, then I think we want to be quite liberal on how data flows, because it enhances and enables prosperity. I think we also want to make sure that e-commerce transactions are made as frictionless as possible. So definitely no customs duties on e-commerce transactions, another kind of key UK ask as well. So moving forward in the age that we're in, and making sure that trade is both digitally and data enhanced, and making sure that we do more to help our increasingly prominent fintech and other tech sectors, a big part of the UK's future. And I think New Zealand has the same view.
Great, thank you. Yes, we admire your fintech sector from afar, and I know that our own businesses in that space are very keen to deepen the connections there. So that's fantastic to hear. I guess kind of zooming out a little bit to the global rules-based trading system, from the very granular to the very big. Of course, the WTO is facing some really quite significant challenges this year. There's a lot of churn, a lot of turbulence. The new Director General selection, the revival of the appellate body, the unfinished business from the Doha round, as you say, the sort of modernisation of the rule book. How, in a practical sense, are we going to be able to move forward on that very sort of important slate of issues?
Well, I think one of the most important things is to get the US back engaging with the WTO. I think we also, at the same time, which I think is strongly coupled to that, is recognizing that the WTO does need reform. It needs to be brought into the age that we're in terms of, already talked about digital trade, e-commerce, and so on. I think more broadly, I think we want to have a better global conversation on what do we want the rules-based international trading system to be doing, and what do we not want it to be doing. I'm not entirely sure that all of the major global players in international trade are even sure themselves what they want the global trading system to be doing. So I think Mike Froman, the former USTR, I know quite well, made this point in the last couple of weeks, that before we get stuck into the sort of nitty-gritty of WTO reform, we need to step back perhaps a little bit and decide, what do we want the world trading system to be doing, and indeed not doing.
We have been so privileged to have you with us today, Minister. Thank you so much for those, very encyclopedic insights into British trade policy and indeed the very disrupted global landscape that we're all trying to contend with. So that's a wonderful note to begin our conference on, and we're very grateful for your contribution today.
Well, thank you, Stephanie, and thank you to everybody at ATEP, the Auckland Trade and Economic Policy, and thank you to everybody at the University of Auckland, and it's been a great pleasure to be with you today. and let's get the deal done.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Robert Scollay from the APEC Study Centre at the University of Auckland, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you Wendy Cutler from the Asia Society Policy Institute. She is the president and the managing director there, and with the world trading system and dramatic political developments in the United States, we're extremely lucky to have Wendy to share her thoughts with us on these developments and these issues. So good morning and good afternoon, Wendy. Welcome, a virtual welcome to New Zealand, and thank you so much for taking time to talk to us.
It's my pleasure.
Okay, just briefly, before Wendy joined the Asia Society, she had a career of almost 30 years with the US Trade Representative. That's like the Ministry of Trade in the United States. And she was acting as the Deputy USTR, the number 2 in command in the USTR. Among many highlights, she was the chief negotiator for the Korea-US Free Trade Agreement. She had responsibility for the US in the TPP negotiations, and she led the US agenda on trade and investment over many years in APEC. So she's a perfect person to enlighten us on what is happening right at the moment. Wendy, could we perhaps start with the obvious question that's no doubt on everybody's minds? What can we expect on trade policy from the new Biden administration, taking into account what the president-elect himself has said and written on the subject, and the various political, administrative, legislative constraints that you'll face? What changes, what elements of continuity can we expect compared to President Trump's trade policy?
Well, I think there are going to be some important differences between Trump's trade policy and Biden's trade policy. First of all, I think that unlike Trump, trade policy is not going to be front and center for the Biden administration. In many respects, Trump's foreign policy was his trade policy. And so I think we're going to see trade assume a lower level of attention. That doesn't mean there are lots of trade issues to work through and trade officials will be very busy. But what it means, it's just not going to be front and center. It's not going to be tweeted out every night. And I think that our relations with countries won't be defined by bilateral trade deficits anymore. So there'll be more predictability. I think you're going to see the restoration of a policy process. So as decisions are taken, they're fully vetted within the administration, including considering views from stakeholders in Congress and foreign governments. In addition, though, I think we will see a trade policy that's much more focused on working with our allies and partners and working within international institutions like the World Trade Organization. We'll see less of this go-it-alone approach and unilateralism and bilateralism. That's not to say that our trading partners shouldn't expect any unilateral measures or requests for bilateral negotiations, but I think the weight is going to shift to the desire to work with allies and partners, particularly when it comes to China. But I also think there'll be some similarities. One will be clearly our overall relationship with China is very tense. And I think Biden is going to be tough on China as well, but may find areas in which to cooperate, particularly with respect to global issues. And another issue of continuity in the trade front will be an emphasis on reshoring American jobs back to the US, bolstering our manufacturing sector, and pursuing more Buy America policies. The Biden camp is very focused on making our foreign policy and trade policy work for the middle class. And I think that's going to mean, again, a focus on manufacturing, not at the expense of services and agriculture and innovative industries, but a definite focus on manufacturing.
Thanks very much. Maybe we'll come back to that last point. But first of all, we in the world of rest of the world will be watching this with great interest, of course. And can you give us some indication of what will be the signals as to the priorities and the direction of trade policy, for example, in key appointments or statements to key meetings and events like the G20, initial contacts with partner countries, maybe some initial executive or legislative changes, including perhaps reversing some of the tariffs that he'll inherit from President Trump. What will be the signals of policy direction as we move forward?
Well, I think all of the above, Rob. I think you really put your finger on the needle here. I would watch closely the selection of the U.S. trade representative. And here, there are many different camps of appointees that people are looking towards. Does Biden choose someone who's a known quantity in the trade arena, someone who is, experienced with experience with past negotiations and, comes with the real expertise? Or does he pick someone without any trade baggage and someone that comes with a clean slate and an open mind? Does he pick a politician, someone who can work with our Congress and help rebuild support in Congress for trade and among the American people? Or does he look more for a technocrat? And finally, I alert all my trading partners to just keep in mind that often the trade representative's job is selected late in the process after all the other secretaries and cabinet officials are named. So sometimes it's just someone who was close to getting another job, but didn't get that other job, so is appointed to USTR. But all that said, I've worked for 9 U.S. trade representatives through my career, and I have to say they were all extremely talented, professional. Some knew trade well, they did a great job. Some didn't know trade at all, and they did an excellent job. So I think that will be very telling. And then once the USTR is selected, the question will be who's in the rest of the team, and in particular, whether there are folks from the progressive camp of the party, either selected as USTR or as deputies. I think that's going to be an important signal as well, because the Democratic Party is still pretty mixed on trade and has different views on trade. And I think what you said as well is how will the U.S. approach allies and partners? Will they try early on to resolve some bilateral irritants, particularly with respect to the European Union? How do they relate to the World Trade Organization? Do they lift or let's just say, do they join the consensus for the Nigerian candidate, Dr. Ngozi, for Director General? And where do they travel? And who do they meet? So I think all of these will be important early signs, but I would just lay down a marker. I don't expect the slew of tariffs that have been imposed by President Trump to be lifted right away or in the near term by President-elect Biden. I think he's going to have to review these tariffs to see if they're working or they're not working, and also show the American people that if he chooses to lift some of them or lower the rate of some of them, that he's gotten something in return. And that means either from China or in return for lifting the steel and aluminum tariffs.
Sure. I guess Congress will be quite a challenge for President Biden. You have traditionally an anti-trade group in the Democratic Congress, and now we have the America First faction in the Republican side of the House and the Senate. Traditionally, there's been a bipartisan coalition between the pro-trade forces in both parties, which have moved trade policy forward. But of course, we know we don't have the same level of bipartisan cooperation as we've had in the past. How is this going to work for the president, the new president?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that the congressional aspect is going to affect the president-elect's ability to pursue his overall agenda and specifically his trade agenda. But what's really interesting right now is it's very unclear who is the coalition in Congress for trade. In the past, before USMCA, for many years, USTRs relied on the Republican Party to deliver the votes for approval of agreements as well as approval of trade promotion authority. But now the Republican Party is really changing on trade. And when you look at some of the polling of just people who associate themselves as being a Republican or a Democrat, there seems to be more support from free trade from the Democratic side. Now, whether that's just an aberration and that's due to people, wanting to oppose anything that Trump is for, that's a possibility. But I think the coalition on trade is changing in Congress. And as a result, it's going to be tricky to navigate through these waters. The other point I would just remind our viewers is that the last trade vote during the Trump administration took place in favor of the USMCA. And that was one of the largest positive votes for a trade agreement, a bipartisan vote. And so some people think that's, a great marker, and that could be a trend going forward if indeed the United States could negotiate successor agreements that resemble the USMCA.
A lot for us to watch out for then. But you did mention the WTO as an important element in the Biden trade policy, and obviously the approach of the Biden administration is going to be watched with a lot of anticipation from the rest of the world, and maybe also with a certain amount of nervousness. What elements of change and continuity do you see there in the US approach to the World Trade Organization? What viable way forward involving the US do you see for the WTO to perhaps restore and sustain its effectiveness in the governance of world trade?
Well, I think it's important to remember that the WTO, it was having problems irrespective of the Trump administration. Granted, some steps were taken over the past 4 years where many people pointed to the United States as the major disruptor. But there are just some long-seated problems in this 25-year-old organization with respect to dispute settlement, negotiating, its governance, and monitoring. But over the past 4 years, the United States clearly has retreated from playing a leadership role in the World Trade Organization. Others, including New Zealand, have tried to work with other middle-sized countries to kind of fill that void with some success, but not being able to turn things around. And I think under a Biden administration, we're going to see the re-engagement and even leadership of the United States in the WTO. But we're not going to go back to where we have been in the past. I think if the United States is going to lead, it will be on select issues of key interest to the United States. And I think we'll be really looking to work with other allies and partners, and we'll want to see them step up to the plate as well.
Right. Can you maybe just briefly highlight what some of these key issues are going to be for the United States and what changes you see as being necessary to make progress?
Well, in particular, from the U.S. view, the quest to improve WTO rules to address practices of state-led economies like China will continue to take front and center stage. And the president-elect has been very clear that he wants to work with allies and partners, and I assume within the WTO, to try and improve rules on industrial subsidies, state-owned enterprises, and the like. So I think that will be a top priority. I also suspect that there will be an earnest attempt to try and fix the appellate body under a Biden administration. But I don't think there's going to be quick success on that front. I think what you might see is the United States table a proposal with specific suggestions for improvements, which could actually launch a negotiation. Up until now, the United States, we haven't tabled a proposal. We've just said, we don't like the appellate body. We're not going to reappoint judges. And we just want to discuss the underlying problems. And that's been of great frustration to our trading partners. So you may see engagement on that front. But again, I think it's going to involve compromise from all sides if that system is going to be fixed. And then I look at issues like e-commerce, which I think it's critical that the plurilateral and e-commerce deliver results soon. I mean, it's kind of hard to understand how, as digital trade comprises more and more of the global trading system, the WTO is still negotiating rules in that area. It's been very slow. And there are some important differences of views, not only between the US and China, but also between the US and the EU. So I think, frankly, New Zealand, through its negotiations and agreement with Singapore and Chile, has provided a good model through the DEPA agreement, which should be looked at. And I don't rule out, perhaps what we need to do is pursue a regional agreement on e-commerce with like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific region, and kind of use that as a lever to get the WTO moving.
Right. Could I maybe just take you back to something you said earlier on, which was that the Biden administration will focus very strongly on bringing manufacturing back to the United States. How will the trade policy that will be driving that fit in with what the Biden administration might do in terms of trade policy globally and even in the WTO?
And that's a great question. And if you look at the president-elect's plan on Buy Back America, a lot of it doesn't have to do with trade. It has to do with tax incentives and other incentives to try and bring U.S. companies back to the United States. However, the one exception is government procurement. And there, in the plan, there is a mention of approaching our trading partners in the government procurement agreement to see if we could renegotiate the terms, particularly when it comes to trade in the medical sector. And I don't think we're alone there. I think many countries were, caught flat-footed with respect to PPE, medicines, and other medical equipment, and still are, frankly, and have recognized their vulnerabilities and their over-reliance on certain trading partners. So I would hope that if the United States wanted to renegotiate the terms of the government procurement agreement, that our trading partners would be open to that. I mean, let's keep in mind, just a week or 2 weeks ago, this administration was on the cusp of withdrawing from the government procurement agreement. And so I would hope other countries then would work with us under a Biden administration to renegotiate the terms versus the U.S. having no choice but to consider withdrawing from the agreement under a Biden administration.
Thank you. Can we maybe turn to the Asia-Pacific region? You've written very extensively on trade and economic integration in the Asia-Pacific region, and in your writings you still actually use the term Asia-Pacific, whereas most of Washington seems to have switched seamlessly to talking about the Indo-Pacific, which I notice you use that term just now as well. We've got two substantial plurilateral agreements in the region now, the CPTPP, which is the remaining TPP members after the US withdrew, and of course the RCEP, the RCEP, which was signed 2 weeks ago after 8 years of negotiations. First of all, what steps would you like to see the Biden administration take towards the CPTPP or the TPP? And what steps do you think the Biden administration and the existing CPTPP members will need to work through when those steps are taken?
Well, from a personal point of view, I thought withdrawing from the TPP under the Trump administration was a huge mistake. I mean, we in my view, the TPP at that point, even though there was considerable domestic opposition, it really delivered a lot of benefits for the United States, both economic and geostrategic. But that's water under the bridge, and other countries now have gone forward and put the agreement in effect without us. So if we wanted to return, it's a very different world. We would be asking to join an agreement among others. Whether that will happen under a Biden administration remains an open question. During the primaries, the president-elect did mention that he would need, that if he was going to rejoin TPP, he would need to seek revisions. But after that time, there was radio silence on the TPP. And I suspect that based on what the president-elect has said to date, I think he's very serious about, before entering into new trade agreements, he really wants to focus on restoring economic recovery in the United States and building strength at home, building our competitiveness at home with respect to education, infrastructure, innovation, R&D. So then the question is, if we're not ready or interested in joining TPP, is there something we can do short of that to re-engage in the Indo-Pacific region? And in my view, I think there are some narrower issues, such as digital trade, supply chains and medical equipment, or the whole issue of trade in the environment and climate change, which are prime candidates for some kind of regional agreement. And if we could negotiate just on one issue and rapidly, and here when I say rapidly, I mean not take 8 years, but maybe take 1 year to negotiate a regional agreement, put that in effect, I think that would really help rebuild trust and build momentum in the United States for more engagement in the region. Clearly, RCEP, I think, has been another wake-up call for the United States. There are now 2 mega deals. We're not part of these deals. And even though we all know that the RCEP agreement is a lot weaker and less ambitious than TPP, it nevertheless is significant, and I believe over time is going to help build intra-Asian supply chains with the United States on the outside. So I think time is right for us to re-engage on trade, but recognize that we have some domestic steps to take before we do that, and also recognize if we were ever to rejoin the TPP or CPTPP, we would need to seek updates and revisions. There's no way the United States could just sign the dotted line on CPTPP without seeking revisions and updates.
And those would go beyond the provisions in the original TPP that were suspended when the US withdrew.
And I don't think the option is going back to the original TPP and just getting those suspended provisions unsuspended. I think our trading partners should look closely at USMCA to get a sense of some of the revisions that Congress and a new administration might have in mind if it were to rejoin the CPTPP.
Right, and when you talked about 2 issues that might be negotiated on a standalone basis, and you've already talked about e-commerce, the other issue you mentioned was supply chains.
And climate environment. Because if that's going to be a priority for the Biden team, then I think an agreement like that will become very it'll become very interesting to the Biden team. If it's all hands-on climate change, then why not bring a trade element in? Remember, we were very close on, for example, environmental goods agreement in the WTO in a plurilateral. Is there a way that could be finalized? Are there ways that restrictions could be put on fossil fuel subsidies? And of course, there's the whole issue of these adjustment taxes, which could be examined as well.
Yeah, well, of those 3 standalone issues, I mean, obviously, e-commerce already faces difficulties with different perspectives from some of the major players, and we could expect that supply chains might be difficult too, given the emphasis on bringing manufacturing back to the US. Do you think that some action on climate change might be the one area where perhaps there could be a meeting of minds across the Pacific?
Well, I think each of these issues presents challenges, right? But again, I think the climate change one could be a prime candidate. But I also think the digital one shouldn't be discounted either, because as a result of COVID, I think we all recognize the importance of the digital economy in our world, not only our work world, but just getting through the day. And a lot of the services we're getting now are being provided by the digital economy. And in addition, a lot of countries, I think, that used to think of a digital trade agreement as an agreement that would just benefit big US companies. I think there's a growing recognition that it's critical to small and medium-sized enterprises as well. So I'm optimistic on the digital front, but again, not with 80 countries in the WTO. I think that's difficult. But if you could widen the circle of the DEPA agreement and you include the United States and other partners in the region that have concluded similar agreements, I think there's a way to thread those agreements together. Again, not taking an incredibly long period of time.
Right, that's a very interesting agenda to be looking forward to. Can we, to complete the conversation, turn towards APEC, which, as you know, New Zealand is hosting next year and will be doing so on a completely virtual basis. And you've had many years of experience in APEC. What would you like to share with us as, if you like, a recipe for a successful hosting of APEC next year in the circumstances that we face?
Well, one thing on APEC I would say is that, I was at U.S. Chair many, many years, and it was only in the last 10 years of my career I was working on APEC. But before then, I was very skeptical of APEC. Like the fact it wasn't producing binding agreements, how useful could it be? But I became a real advocate of APEC by the time I left, and I still am, because I think it does incredibly useful work. Unfortunately, its agenda has been derailed the past few years due to reasons outside of its control, whether it be COVID or the US-China trade dispute or domestic unrest by Chile during its host year. So I think New Zealand has an incredible opportunity to really, put a fire under APEC, deliver important outcomes that are meaningful for people, particularly in the wake of COVID and kind of the economic downturn we're all experiencing. Again, I think there's a lot to accomplish. I worked on APEC during the year the United States hosted in 2011, and a few things I learned from that experience, kind of do's and don'ts. One of my key advice is to really focus on a few key deliverables. That it's overwhelming when you look at all the different committees in APEC and all the different things you could do. I think by really pinpointing a few concrete things you want to accomplish at the outset helps the host kind of guide the year through. And folks might not remember, but during our year, we put a big emphasis on reducing tariffs on environmental goods. And that was one of the key outcomes that we produced in our year, along with outcomes and good regulatory practices and a couple of other issues. The other advice I would give, and something we really tried to do, was to just shorten these statements, because what we found in previous years, and frankly, after we hosted, we saw in future years that the member economies spent so much time negotiating the words in a statement, which frankly would have the shelf life of 24 hours. And that was really at the expense of doing concrete work. So we tried to shorten them, to streamline them, and to prevent overlap between minister statements and the leader's statements, and really focus on, I think our leader's statement was like a page and a half in 2011. And finally, we really, and it's different for New Zealand this year because there'll be virtual meetings, but because all our meetings were in person, we just tried to limit the number of ministers' meetings. And when we had ministerial meetings, we tried to kind of streamline them around around senior officials meetings and the actual, we'd have clusters of meetings. And then I would just say one of the key issues that we learned the hard way, something not to try and do, and that is to try and get rid of some committees or make some big institutional changes in APEC, because it takes so much energy and resources. And at the end of the day, we weren't successful. Unfortunately, I think APEC has gotten way too big. The agenda is spread out over lots and lots of committees. It's always easy to add a committee or a task force. It's much more difficult to get rid of one. But my recommendation would be not to put your eggs in the basket of trying to make procedural changes. Focus on the work, focus on the outcomes. And again, I think New Zealand, particularly being the host after 3 years of mixed results, New Zealand has an incredible opportunity. And I know the team they're putting together to lead APEC this year is phenomenal. So I have a lot of confidence and hope that New Zealand's really going to put APEC back on the map this year.
Well, that seems like a very good, optimistic note on which to end. So I think maybe we'll stop there. And thank you very much for taking the time to share your insights with us. It's been a real pleasure to listen to you, and I'm sure we'll all learn a lot from what you had to say. Thank you again.
Well, thank you so much. It's really been my pleasure.